I am 97 years old. On my kitchen windowsill, right next to the dish soap and a little potted plant my granddaughter gave me, there's a brass casing sitting in a glass dish. It's tarnished, almost black. People who come over think it's a trinket, something decorative. My granddaughter once picked it up and asked if it was a bullet. I told her, it's what a bullet lives in before it becomes one. I picked that casing up off a concrete floor in July of 1943. I was 19 years old, on my hands and knees at the Lake City Ordnance Plant outside Independence, Missouri. A guide rail had snapped loose and scattered brass across the floor. I was gathering them up like pennies, and while I was down there, I noticed something that changed the rest of my life, and as far as I know, nobody ever wrote my name down for it. So let me tell you exactly what happened. In the summer of 1943, the United States of America was running out of ammunition. Not because the enemy sank supply ships, not because factories weren't running. We simply could not produce rounds fast enough. The War Department estimated we needed 2.4 billion rounds every month to sustain operations in the Pacific and the Mediterranean. We were making barely half that. Marines in the Solomon Islands were rationing rifle rounds. Infantry units in Sicily were cutting training fire because they weren't sure they'd have enough for actual combat. Platoon leaders were writing home, begging their families to petition Congress for more bullets. That sounds impossible, but those letters existed. I saw references to them on the notice boards at Lake City. The crisis was real. I had been at the plant for 12 weeks. I came from a farm outside Kansas City. I had never seen the inside of a factory before 1942. I earned 80 cents an hour. I learned to work machines that could crush your hand in an instant, in heat that would shut down any building you work in today. Supervisors carried pocket thermometers, and they routinely showed 97 degrees on the floor. You adapted because you had to. Nobody complained. Complaining didn't put brass on the belts. Complaining didn't end the war 1 minute sooner. The plant employed thousands of women. We came from farms, shops, kitchens. We learned stamping presses, annealing furnaces, conveyor systems, and the most important part of the whole operation was the feeder station. That was where raw brass casings had to be fed by hand into alignment tracks before they could be charged and crimped. 6 women at a table. Pick, place, slide. Pick, place, slide. 3 motions repeated thousands of times every hour. The plant needed 30,000 casings fed per hour on each line. Most days we stalled at 23,000. That gap, scaled across the whole facility, meant millions of missing rounds every 24 hours. And somewhere in the Pacific, a Marine machine gun crew was firing faster than we could replenish. Everyone accepted that the bottleneck was a human speed problem. Engineers had designed that feeder system in 1918 and never changed it. 25 years of trained professionals looking at the same process and deciding it couldn't go faster. The false belief, the one nobody questioned, was that the only way to increase output was to make human hands move quicker, push harder, work longer shifts, demand more from muscles that were already bleeding from repetitive motion. That belief was wrong. The morning the guide rail snapped, July 1943, I was on my knees gathering scattered casings when I looked up and saw the women's hands moving. Pick, place, slide, an orbit, a circle. And something from a high school history textbook flashed in my mind. The Gatling gun. Multiple barrels rotating, so no single barrel had to cool between shots. The firing rate increased, not because each barrel fired faster, but because the machine carried the motion forward. Rotation instead of repetition. What if the feeder worked the same way? Not a line of hands fighting fatigue, but a wheel that carried the casings for us. I couldn't let it go. At 9:23 that morning, I slipped away from the line and went to a scrap bin near the east wall. Broken pallets, bent brackets, discarded bearing rings. I pulled out what I could and ducked behind a stack of crates near the maintenance shed. I started arranging wooden slats around a bearing ring, trying to visualize casings sitting in recesses along the edge of a rotating plate. My fingers trembled. I wasn't supposed to be there. I had no business inventing anything. But the idea would not leave. A mechanic came out of the shed and found me kneeling on the concrete with lumber arranged in a strange pattern. He raised an eyebrow. I tried to explain. A circular feeder, a rotating platform, redistribution of load. He didn't laugh. He asked one question. What problem are you trying to solve? I said, throughput. That was a language everyone at Lake City understood. I went to a drafting table near the supervisor's office and drew it with a pencil stub. A central ring, a rotating plate with peripheral slots angled to cradle casings, a mechanical linkage to the existing conveyor motor. I didn't know torque specs or metallurgy, but I knew the math. 9 revolutions per minute, roughly 1,000 casings per revolution. Multiply by 60 minutes, and a single wheel could exceed 60,000 units per hour. Add synchronized wheels, stagger the rotation so there are no empty cycles, and the number climbs past 100,000. At 11:22, they gave me 3 minutes to test it. Not 4, not 5. The war did not pause to indulge ideas. I set a crude wooden wheel on a temporary spindle. The mechanic attached a belt from a discarded motor. The wheel jerked, wobbled, spun unevenly. I placed 3 casings. 1 fed correctly. 1 bounced out. The 3rd shot across the bench and clattered onto the floor. The workers laughed. Tired, honest laughter. The build was wrong, but the idea wasn't dead. On the last rotation, the mechanic steadied the wheel with both hands and slowed it to the sweep of a lighthouse beam. I placed 3 more casings. 1 fed cleanly. The 2nd corrected itself at the guide lip. The 3rd wobbled, but landed exactly where it needed to. A ripple of surprise moved through the group. Not success yet, but motion that made sense. An older woman from line 4 walked over afterward. She put a casing in my hand and pointed at a dent along the rim. "You see that?" she said. "That's from fatigue. Repetition does that to metal. And to people." She looked at my crooked wooden wheel. "Anything that reduces that is worth trying." At 12:47, I was called up to the supervisor's platform. A procurement officer, a plant engineer, and the mechanic were all standing around my sketch, weighted down with brass casings. The engineer asked me to explain it again. I stumbled at first, then found my rhythm. When I finished, he tapped the margin where I had drawn a 2nd wheel and asked why. I told him, "1 wheel feeds continuously only if the next one is already reloading. Staggered rotation means no pauses, no dead time. 3 synchronized wheels at 9 revolutions each. Theoretical throughput approaching 100,000 per hour." The procurement officer authorized a steel prototype to be built overnight. That night, under harsh white lamps, sparks fell from welding torches, and steel rang under hammers. The wheel was 28 inches across, cut from 1/4-inch steel, with a stabilizing ring welded around the edge, and rubber scavenged from tires lining each slot. They tested it with 20 casings. 19 fed correctly. 1 jammed and righted itself. That ratio would have sounded ordinary to anyone who didn't know what 19-to-1 meant in a plant that was losing the war by fractions of a second. The next morning at 7-11, they flipped the switch on line 2. The feeder wheel turned with a steady, deliberate heartbeat. No wobble, no death rattle. Casings flowed into the alignment channels faster than anyone had seen. The counter climbed past 700 per minute, then 740, then 783. By 744, hourly output hit 80,000. Lake City had never reached that number. The superintendent authorized 3 more units immediately. Full redesign of line 2. Phased conversion of every remaining line. A memo went to Washington. It noted an experimental increase in feeder efficiency. It included numbers and percentages and projections. It did not include my name. Within 6 months, the rotating feeder system was installed in every major ammunition plant in America. Engineers refined the design. They understood metallurgy and torque better than I ever could. But the core principle never changed. Rotation instead of linear motion. A wheel instead of a line. A system that worked with human fatigue instead of against it. By D-Day, the men who hit those beaches never ran short of bullets. The Marines who fought across the Pacific fired without rationing rounds. The aerial gunners who defended bombers over Germany emptied their belts, knowing that more ammunition was on the way. None of them knew that their firepower depended partly on a teenage girl with a pencil stub and a borrowed bearing ring. When the war ended, the women were sent home. No medals, no parades, no mention in the history books. We were expected to go back to kitchens and nurseries, to act like the years of grueling labor had been an interruption, not a transformation. Most of us never talked about it. The calluses healed, the memories went quiet. I married. I raised children. I lived in a suburb where nobody knew what I had done. And I never resented it. Not exactly, but I knew. I knew what that wooden wheel meant. I knew what that sketch on packing paper became. And I knew that the memo that went to Washington carried numbers, not names, because in 1943, nobody thought a 19-year-old girl's name belonged in a government report. Here's what I want you to understand, whoever's listening. Innovation doesn't always come from laboratories or boardrooms. Sometimes it comes from the person closest to the problem, the one whose hands are bleeding from the rhythm of a broken system, The mothers and grandmothers who stood at those machines understood something that comfortable peacetime lets you forget. Wars are won not by armies alone, but by the accumulation of small improvements. A few seconds saved at a station, multiplied by hundreds of workers, scaled across 12 lines, across 24 hours, across the years of a global conflict. That was America's secret weapon. Not just industrial power, but the willingness to listen when someone unexpected said, "I have an idea." I am 97 years old, and that brass casing on my windowsill is the only proof I have that I was ever there.